This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. With part two of our discussion about speculation mounting that former Vice President Joe Biden will soon enter the race for the Democratic presidential nomination. A longtime senator from Delaware, Biden has previously run twice for the Democratic nomination, last time in 2008, when he ultimately became then-Senator Barack Obama's running mate, while a new campaign would seek to capitalize on Biden's two terms as vice president. It would also invite scrutiny of his Senate record in a Democratic political climate that's notably more progressive today than it was when Biden last sought the nomination. Joe Biden's 1994 crime bill, while implementing sweeping gun control, also helped fuel mass incarceration with financial incentives to keep people behind bars. This is Joe Biden, Senator Joe Biden, speaking in 1993 during the debate on the Senate crime bill. The clip was recently unearthed by CNN.
We must take back the streets. It doesn't matter whether or not the person that is accosting your son or daughter or my son or daughter, my wife, your husband, my mother, your parents. It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter or not whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask, what made them do this? They must be taken off the street.
Senator Biden went on to describe criminals as predators.
If we don't, they will, or a portion of them will, become the predators 15 years from now. And, Madam President, we have predators on our streets that society has, in fact, in part because of its neglect, created.
Joe Biden's also known for close ties to the financial industry, notably helping push through a 2005 bill that made it harder for consumers to declare bankruptcy. According to the New York Times, the credit card issuer MBNA was Biden's top donor from 1989 to 2010. One of his key legislative achievements was the 2005 bankruptcy law that made it harder to reduce student debt, preventing most Americans from claiming bankruptcy protections for private student loans. Well, to continue our conversation on Joe Biden and his possible presidential run, we go to Washington, D.C. to talk with Washington editor for Harper's Magazine, Andrew Cockburn. His latest piece for Harper's headlined, No Joe, Joe Biden's Disastrous Legislative Legacy. Thank you for staying for part two of this conversation, Andrew. So let's talk more deeply about the crime bill and Senator Joe Biden's involvement in that and where you see his trajectory today.
Well, I mean, it was his signature issue really throughout the 1980s. As I mentioned earlier, you know, he teamed up with Strom Thurmond, this sort of very aged old segregationist from South Carolina. You know, really the face of everything that we'd been trying to get away from. And it was really, you know, Joe, he thought this was going to really propel him to the top. As he said to a former aide who told me, I think it was around about 1990, the aide was telling me how Joe was always trying to hold hearings on crime and drugs. Every week, his poor staff had to sit around dreaming up a new excuse for a hearing on crime and drugs. And as Biden said to his staffer, he said, when people hear the words crime and drugs, I want them to think Joe Biden. I mean, he was really running, you know, like George Bush Sr. on a sort of Willie Horton. You know, it's astonishing that this politician should be considered a front runner for the Democrats.
Now, could he simply say he's changed since then, that he's completely reversed his position?
Well, not really. I mean, he's flubbed on a few things. I mean, he changed, you know, he's apologized for a few things. Not, I note, on busing. not on choice, where his record is truly terrible. He has said that he's kind of sorry, a bit sorry about his crime legislation, and he said he's sorry he voted for the financial deregulation, the key repeal of Glass-Steagall. He said that was the worst vote ever of his entire career, there's a lot of competition there. So, but even if, just thinking of his political viability, supposing he has to go through the campaign saying, well, I'm sorry I did what I did on busing. I'm sorry I did what I did on crime. I'm sorry I did what I did on banks. He's going to sound like another shifty politician.
And on Anita Hill, I'm sorry what I did on
Anita Hill. I'm really sorry about Anita Hill. He's expressed some regret for that, I should admit. So, his record has very little that's good about it. He has this sort of shtick of being the friend of the working man, but, he's been much better and closer friend of the financial industry.
Talk about what happened with Neil Kinnock, the speech.
Well, very bizarre that. Neil Kinnock, who at that time was the leader of the Labour Party, had this, standard stump speech in Britain, British Labour Party, and he would, in his stump speech, he would say that, why was it that he was the first Kinnock in 1,000 years to go to college, and Mrs. Kinnock, I think he invoked too, as being the first from her family to go to college. And he made a moving sort of rags to riches sort of piece out of that. And Biden heard this, or his speechwriter did, and thought, that sounds good, and simply substituted the word Biden. Why am I the first Biden in 1,000 years to go to college? And so on and so forth. And what's particularly ironic about it is that Neil Kinnock was known in Britain as the Welsh windbag, because he went on. And, of course, Biden himself is a terrible windbag. So it was really bizarre to have one windbag plagiarizing another.
I wanted to talk about Iraq. In 2002, former chief UN weapons inspector in Iraq, Scott Ritter, said, quote, Senator Joe Biden's running a sham hearing. It's clear Biden and most of the congressional leadership have preordained a conclusion that seeks to remove Saddam Hussein from power regardless of the facts, and are using these hearings to provide political cover for a massive military attack on Iraq. These hearings have nothing to do with an objective search for the truth, but rather seek to line up like-minded witnesses who will buttress this predetermined result, Ritter said. That same year, in 2002, Senator Biden said, quote, we must be clear with the American people that we're committing to Iraq for the long haul, not just the day after, but the decade after. I'm absolutely confident the president will not take us to war alone, he said. Talk about the significance of that then, and then what it could mean for today.
Well, it fits into, Biden's, worldview or behavior on the international stage throughout, which is as a very hardline hawk. As you just said, as Ritter said at the time, Biden was really doing everything he could to assist George Bush in the run-up to the illegal invasion of Iraq. On the Foreign Relations Committee, he summoned just, pro-invasion witnesses. As far as I know, he was certainly not one of the famous of the 5 senators who took the trouble to go down and read the national intelligence estimate that Senator Bob Graham has talked about, which was locked away down in the basement, which would have told them that there was a lot of doubts in the intelligence community as to whether Saddam had weapons of mass destruction and so forth. No, he just, he wanted. He was all for war, and he was all for occupation, as you said. And that fits in with, his record since. He's most notably, as vice president, Obama made Vice President Biden, gave him really the Iraq file, but also the Ukraine file. And Biden used that to be an ardent proponent of, more arms for Ukraine, for intervention in what is really a civil war in Ukraine. Of course, his family, his son had very extensive business ties in Ukraine, which doesn't look too good, his son Hunter. was on the board of the Ukrainian gas company. So, Biden, whenever he's been given the chance, he's been for armed intervention. He was ardently for the expansion of NATO, the post 1990 in the 1990s, which is really the root cause of the renewed sort of the new Cold War. I mean, Biden was there. It's no surprise that he describes John McCain as his best friend in the Senate.
Biden also said in 2002, "I do not believe this is a rush to war. I believe it's a march to peace and security." So, Andrew Cockburn, if you could comment on his two runs for president, both failed. All the media is saying the polls show he's the, number one now, followed by Bernie Sanders. But, of course, he's got the biggest name recognition nationally. He was vice president for 8 years under President Obama.
Well, that's right. I mean, it is largely a factor of name recognition. But also, we have to think about those two runs and what it showed. First of all, there was, as we've discussed, this astonishing gaffe in 1988, where he wasn't just plagiarizing this British politician, by the way. It turned out that his speeches also had extensive passages lifted from Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King, unbelievably. So it's kind of. It's hard to explain. It's really a sort of mental issue. But then that sank his. It's not clear that his campaign was going anywhere anyway at that time. And then in 2008, he didn't even have that excuse of a plagiarism. I mean, he made an astonishing remark about Barack Obama early on, where he described him as clean. I mean, it was a very sort of racist, almost racist-sounding, patronizing remark. And he got nowhere. He really sputtered, and his campaign sputtered and died. So it's pretty bizarre to me, this sort of cheering squad for Biden, run, Joe, run. And I think, actually, what clip you showed featured of him at the firefighters convention yesterday was very telling, because it sounded like I can hear Donald Trump invoking, low energy again. He didn't sound like a, ready to go politician at all to me. He sounded sort of rather weary. I have the feeling sometimes that in his heart, he doesn't want to do it. That's why we've had this sort of Hamlet performance for months now. And the people around him, all these longtime aides, this is their chance for, a ticket in the big game, to be in on a big-time presidential campaign, and they're kind of pushing him into it. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think, if he does run, those poll numbers will come down in a hurry. He's not an effective campaigner. He hates preparation. He hates, debate prep. He's not a great fundraiser. He doesn't like having to sort of kowtow to big donors to get money. He's got such an inflated ego. I really think that I'm not the only person saying this. People who've known him for a long time think the same, that what he really wants is to be anointed. Please, Mr. Biden, please come and be our candidate. Please come and be our president, without having to go through the hard grind, the incredible exhaustion of a modern presidential campaign.
Andrew, could you talk about the media's coverage of him? You were really among the first, if not the first one, in this period to start really seriously analyzing Joe Biden's record as a senator and then as a vice president. Then the rest of the media started, repeating some of what you had to say.
Well, yes. Oh, thank you. But that is true. But I mean, the pack, now they're all busy at work, the CNN digging out that very damning clip you played earlier. And there's going to be a lot more of that. I mean, already there's, things I didn't know that are coming up. And just imagine what it's going to be like when he has 12 other Democrats, sort of chasing him around the ring. It's going to be like Lord of the Flies or something. It's, the people, Oppo research can be pretty good these days, and there's a lot to come out. And he has so many deficiencies as a candidate, including, I should say, because the Republicans are already saying it, a Me Too problem. I mean, if you look on sort of Republican websites and Twitter accounts, there's a montage going around of of Joe Biden with women at photo ops, including some quite young women, children really, apparently fondling them. I'm sure it's all very just avuncular and everything, but as one political fundraiser and operative said to me, a lady said I was never talking to him, but he wasn't stroking my back. He's very tactile, which is, I'm sure, is entirely innocent. But don't think that the Republicans won't make a lot of hay with that, and probably his Democratic rivals too.
And of course, you start with Anita Hill. He was head of the Senate Judiciary Committee when, we mentioned it in part one of our discussion, but talk about exactly the role he played as chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee for the Clarence Thomas confirmation, how he responded to Anita Hill first coming forward.
Well, very reluctantly. He didn't really want to put her on. He was just so uncomfortable with the whole thing. He assured, it's a telling remark, because he just before the hearings, or at the beginning of the hearings, he was walking, I believe it was Clarence Thomas's mother, into the hearings, and he said words to the effect of, "Don't worry, Mrs. Thomas, your son will be okay with us, or I'll look after your son." He fancies himself as a great sort of legal authority. Because he'd done, the Bork hearings had gone quite well from his point of view. Robert Bork, a previous Supreme Court nominee who the Democrats had managed to, the Senate had rejected. And so Biden really, his view of himself as a sort of, a great legal scholar was really inflated. So he fancied himself as having sort of serious legal discussions with Clarence Thomas. And the fact that this black woman was coming forward with some very convincing stories of the true nature of Clarence Thomas was obviously unsettling to him. And then he panicked, because the Republicans mounted a very, adroit and forceful pushback campaign against poor Anita Hill. And so when there was, he was offered two more witnesses who would back up what she was saying, he panicked and just wanted to close the whole thing down as quickly as possible before the Republicans broadcast more rude remarks about him.
I want to go to a clip of Anita Hill. Let's turn to then Senator Joe Biden, Senate Judiciary Committee chair, questioning Anita Hill in 1991.
You tell the committee what was the most embarrassing of all the incidences that you have alleged.
I think the one that was the most embarrassing was his discussion of pornography involving these women with large breasts and engaged in variety of sex with different people or animals. That was the thing that embarrassed me the most and made me feel the most humiliated.
That was Anita Hill being questioned by Senate Judiciary Chair Joe Biden back in 1991. In an interview with Elle magazine last year, Anita Hill noted Biden acknowledged he owed her an apology, but he never took the next step. Andrew.
Well, there you go. He said he owed her an apology, but didn't deliver. This is fitting. Fits in with Biden's sort of general behavior. He doesn't like admitting he was wrong. He doesn't like, he doesn't like anything that sort of interferes with his self-image, which is, strangely enough, that of a fearless, fighter for the working man, despite his record as a champion of civil rights. He, as he said at Strom Thurmond's funeral, where he gave the eulogy, he said, got into politics impassioned about the fate of black people and, champion of civil rights. I think he tells himself that. But it's not true. And so that, he hasn't even had the grace to call up Anita Hill and say, look, I'm really, really sorry for what happened to you, is very telling.
Andrew, we have less than 2 minutes, but he already ran for president twice. What happened then in 1988 and in 2008?
what happened, I mean, he ran for president twice and failed miserably both times. I mean, he was. It's really astonishing that he's considered a serious candidate at the moment, because his record in national electoral politics is abysmal. I mean, he was rescued by Obama in 2008, who wanted a sort of older white elder statesman to balance his ticket. But I do know that he drove the Obama team crazy, to trying to get him to stay on message, trying to get him to to stick to the point, not to ramble on. He was terrible in debate prep. His aides had to keep him focused. They kept saying to him, "Listen, just think 3 words, Air Force 2, to get him to sort of toe the line, do what the Obama managers, who were pretty good at their job, were telling him to do, and not sort of ramble off."
Well, Andrew Cockburn, I want to thank you for being with us. Washington editor for Harper's Magazine. His latest piece for Harper's headline, "No Joe, Joe Biden's Disastrous Legislative Legacy." We'll link to it at democracynow.org. Also, to see part 1 of our discussion with Andrew Cockburn, go to democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.